Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here on behalf, as you know, of my colleague and fellow researcher, Dr. Arthur Berkman from Magdalen College, Cambridge. And it's my pleasure to be able to contribute to the 77th Rose-Roth seminar entitled Changes in the High North, Implications for NATO and Beyond. I'd like very sincerely to thank the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and also the Norwegian Parliament for their wonderful invitation to this beautiful summer solstice setting of Tromsø to share with you some insights in my own humble way on diminishing sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, impacts of newly navigable waters, which, as you know, being parliamentarians from NATO nations, is a huge challenge geopolitically. Now, as you are aware, the Arctic Ocean is in the centre of a globally relevant challenge that's currently being amplified by today's trend in climate warming. Interests in the Arctic Ocean extend most immediately from the surrounding stakeholders and rights holders. I'm talking here about the Arctic states and the indigenous peoples. So they extend beyond these parties to the non-Arctic states and to global civil society as a whole. The challenge then is to reconcile these various interests in a manner that promotes sustainable development in and from the Arctic Ocean, balancing environmental protection, economic prosperity, and of course social equity. Now, I would say that stability and stewardship are at the very heart of this emerging dialogue that's going to become increasingly relevant across the 21st century and hopefully beyond, assuming there is still a world beyond the 21st century. If we turn now to my second slide, you will see that the Arctic Ocean is intimately connected to the Earth system, with its long-standing cap of sea ice that reflects heat back into space, impacting on the temperatures of the Earth's climate. Like other areas on Earth, superimposed on the Arctic Ocean, we have geopolitical boundaries that underscore sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdictions. If we were to take a step back and look at the Earth on a planetary scale, there are basically two flavours of governance in the world. Approximately 30% of the Earth's surface falls within the boundaries of nations and nation-states, separating regions based on national interests. Now, the history of our civilization is written by, of course, these conflicting national interests. After World War II, we saw a transition because our civilization was being inexorably introduced to the interconnectedness of nations. The very concept of a world war indicates this. Now, since 1945, it has become clear that forever after, it is really an urgent matter to peacefully resolve issues that transcend national boundaries, which is why humankind established the United Nations and, of course, NATO in that same year. It was also a factor in the wording of the North Atlantic Charter, which affirms, and I quote, the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN and their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments, to safeguard the freedom, common heritage and civilization of their peoples, and to promote stability and well-being in the entire North Atlantic area. End of quote. So, in today's brave new world, issues are being recognised that cross the boundaries of nations and extend beyond sovereign jurisdictions into regions that our civilization has collectively defined using legal institutions as international spaces. In fact, very recently within NATO, we have coined a new term for these international spaces, and we call them the global commons. It is man's common patrimony. I'm speaking now about various legal instruments that have been adopted over the years to govern these spaces. We have the Treaty on the High Seas in 1958, the Treaty on Antarctica in 1959, the Treaty on Outer Space in 1967, and the Deep Sea Treaty in 1971. As with the UN itself, these international spaces reveal what are called the common interests and aspirations of all humankind. Now, the Arctic Ocean, to come back to the ocean, is a system bounded on one side by the seafloor, on the other by the permanent sea ice cap, and then laterally by the surrounding land areas. The Arctic Ocean is intimately connected to the world ocean, with inflow and outflow from the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. As with the Earth's climate, the dynamics of the Arctic Ocean are largely driven by the solar cycle, which influences circulation in the ocean as well as the atmosphere above sea level. What is termed by experts as the sun-driven seasonality, so the seasonal effect as a function of the influence of the sun, which we experience across the entire planet, is firstly influenced by the tilt of the Earth's axis, which is why the Arctic Ocean, why the Arctic Circle is at 66.5 degrees north, which provides an unambiguous astronomical boundary to delimit the Arctic Ocean. Now, the dynamics of the Arctic Ocean system as a whole directly influence natural ecosystems, and also the adjacent human populations of indigenous peoples, not to mention the surrounding coastal states such as Norway, Denmark, Canada, the US, the Russian Federation, and Iceland, as well as two non-coastal Arctic states, which are Sweden and Finland. It's important to note that among the 6 Arctic coastal states I have enumerated, the Russian Federation is the only one that is not actually a member of NATO, and in fact is not actually on very good terms with NATO these days. Historically, the Arctic Ocean has been characterized by its sea ice, that, as you know, accretes over a great number of years. Now, this has changed in recent years. Rather than projecting out to the mid-21st century, when the Arctic Ocean could well become open water, we can see instead that the system already has crossed the threshold, a very important threshold, with more than 50% of sea ice newly forming each year, which is another way of saying that half the sea ice in the Arctic is melting year on year and then reforming in the Arctic winter, which means in fact that we already have a new Arctic Ocean system, which is profoundly disquieting. In fact, the Arctic Ocean is undergoing the largest environmental state change on Earth. It's transforming the North Pole from a sea ice cap that has persisted for many millennia, perhaps even hundreds of millennia, to an annual sea ice system which melts and refreezes. It's as if this room with a floor, ceiling and walls had inflow and outflow through doors being created into the room by melting sea ice. If you remove the ceiling, which is the actual ice cap, the dynamics of the entire room contained within that ceiling will be altered because they're exposed now to outside weather. So all bets basically are off for the future of the Arctic Ocean. Let me move on now to the actual interests involved in the Arctic Ocean. The interests at play in the Arctic Ocean and the active involvement of non-Arctic nations in the region are very long-standing. The table on the screen now shows some of the Arctic and non-Arctic nations involved with the various Arctic organisations, principal among which is the high-level forum of the Arctic Council, established back in 1996 with involvement of the 8 Arctic states and 6 indigenous peoples organisations. How much longer? 2 minutes? And also the 6 other nations which are now observers in the Arctic Council. Let me talk about some more factors which are involved in the transition of the way in which we manage the Arctic. There are a number of fora involving all the Arctic states. There's the Arctic Ocean Science Board, comprising 16 nations, founded in 1984. There's the Forum of Arctic Research Operators, founded back in 1998 and involving 17 nations. There's the International Arctic Science Committee, founded in 1990 with 16 member states. There's the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum, founded in 2007 involving 20 countries. And lastly, there's the Treaty concerning the archipelago of Spitsbergen and its protocol, founded back in 1920 and involving 42 signatory states. Thank you for your time. C'est assez long? It's gone all black, is that normal? Okay.